hoy tenemos la suerte, la inmensa suerte de contar con Lynn Huntsinger.
Good, excellent. Perfect.
Está haciendo voy a presentar en español primero. I will introduce you in Spanish.
Perfect.
When I think everybody understands English, of course. Es profesora en la Universidad de California, en Berkeley, en el campus de Berkeley, y está realizando una estancia aquí en España en la Universidad de Extremadura. Y hemos tenido la inmensa suerte que va a pasar este fin de semana aquí y le hemos cazado al lazo para que venga a dar una charla, que muy amablemente aquí. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much for coming to Madrid and to spend some time with us with your. As you can see, she has chosen a very exciting title with this idea of forestry and destroying. So please, we expect to have a wonderful time with you here, both this in Madrid and also in your talk. So thank you very much again, and please go ahead.
Okay, don't forget the lights. Thank you very much for inviting me here, Sonia and Aida. I really appreciate it. Even though I started in the forestry department at Berkeley, and I'm still in the same department as our forestry program, I can't think that I've ever given a talk at a forestry school. So this is very exciting for me too. I'm going to talk about something that this talk is kind of built around some research that I did and have done. So this isn't a presentation of a current project, but it's a talk that I built mostly for teaching about forestry based on a couple of different research projects. So I hope you'll enjoy the talk. It's a bit of a history talk, I think, but it's a history talk that I believe is very important to the kinds of issues that we face today, especially with climate change, with the different ways that our forests have changed. Now, as you may know, I'm actually not a forester. I'm a range manager. I don't think you have that word. It'd be like an ingeniero del grassland in Spanish, I think. There's so many words that don't translate exactly, I know. But I really study grasslands and woodlands that are similar to your dehesa, actually, and yet very different. So my specialty is in that area, so you have to forgive me if I take some liberties with forestry. Okay. All right, so what's a forest? You guys are the experts, right? So you know what a forest is, right? And I'm going to talk about that first, then I'm going to talk about something I call the native forest, and then I'm going to talk about scientific forestry, and then I'm going to talk about the new forest. And I'm really talking about California. That's what I know the most about. But maybe it'll be related to Spain. Actually, we have a similar climate, right? In California, I think it's the same temperature in my hometown as it is here today. Right now, it's raining. The flowers are coming out. It's been so beautiful every time I go outside and into the woodlands and see these flowers. I think you have better flowers here for sure. Okay. So what is a forest? It is a forest about these trees. Is it dark enough, do you think? Can it be just a little bit darker? Because we have the... No, wrong. Okay, I think that's better. Okay, so is it about the trees? Is it about the timber? This is, of course, a historical photo of redwood logging in California. Is it about cows? For me, it might be about cows. This is where I did my dissertation research on these cows. Is it a place to play music and relax? Climb? Have exciting adventures? Place to take your goats? That's my daughter, Julia. Mi hija. Right? Okay. Place to have competitive sports? Ride horses and chase sheep? I don't know why. Hunt? Plant crops? People all over the world, the forest is a farm for them. A place for this forester. Is this a forester harvesting his crops in the forest? Place for wildlife. We have lots of these in California. A place for Hakuna Matata or whatever it is. And Bambi. Place for magic. Place for scientists. Yes, of course. We know what to do with a forest. Who knows? A place where we have like a military organization in charge who tells us what we can and can't do. Is that a forest? Is it a place that only certain people can go? Is it a home? Well, if we look at people who've made the forest a home, we get some insights into how people have related to forests more sustainably for a very long time. So my first conclusion is obviously that a forest is all kinds of things, right? It has a role in literature and magic and history, in industry. Forest is all those things. I'm sure you know that because, at least in the United States, our foresters are going crazy trying to make everybody happy with what they manage forests for, because everybody has a different idea. So a forest is different things, but the native forest, that's what I'm going to talk about next, is the forest as a home. And people around the world have made forests their home, right? They've lived in the forest for a long time. And there's one characteristic about this that I want to talk about. For one thing, they need to get from the forest. They can't go to Costco or Corte Inglés. They need to get their food, clothing, everything from the forest. Here we are, we're in Europe. And so, when you look back in history, you can see that the forest a long time ago was a much more mixed-use place. A lot of different things that the forest was used for in Europe, historically. This is from Bruegel, of course, 1500. In Germany, in the Black Forest, there was a great deal of swidden. I think in the United States, we have no idea that they used to burn in the Black Forest. It's supposed to be black with big trees, In the United States, we have no idea that swidden was a big deal. Burning and planting and burning and all this stuff was a very common tool in the forests, for example, of Germany and in many other parts of Europe, Northern Europe. This is a friend of mine, studies big trees in Romania, and he complains that they used to graze and burn and all this stuff in this pasture to keep it like this, and now look at it, trees. And he says this is a big loss of biodiversity in only about 9 years. So you probably know something about this, right? I looked at these slides last night and I said, oh no, I'm talking about oak wood de Hesa in Spain. How embarrassing. But we know that people have been using these oak woodlands for really a long time. This is near Évora, I believe, in Portugal. I love this picture. See this guy, he's out with his pigs. This is from the Book of Hours. Wait, and that's me. So it's a woodland that's created, that's built by people, right? A lot of people, Spanish people go to California and they look at our oak woodland and they assume that we created our oak woodlands too, but we didn't. There's big differences between the two systems, even though they look a lot alike. And over the long term, the process has been a balancing of oaks and grass. Balancing these two things, trees and understory plants, making a balance. And that's a characteristic that I think you see in many parts of the world where people have lived in forests. They've created more grass. In many places where there tend to be a lot of trees, people have had to create more grass and more shrubs because that's where they get the things they need from life, many of them. You can't eat a tree very much. You can sure eat acorns. And as a result of this balance of oaks and grass, you also have a balance or a diversity of species and a diversity of products too. And so you guys know this, but I think this is a great picture. My husband took it. So you have this system where you manage to keep more grass and you wind up being able to produce a lot of things. I saw this at a conference here one time, and I thought it was so interesting because in the United States we think of it as the more you use it, the less biodiversity. But here it's pretty clear that somewhere in the middle you have a pretty high level of biodiversity. You have the abandoned and overexploited, and then you have this balance that I'm trying to talk about. It's biodiversity hotspot. I recognize this very handsome gentleman. And a whole bunch of products. So by doing this balancing, you achieve this treasure trove of things. Now, a guy named Sharma in 1996 wrote a book called Landscape and Memory, and he talks about the Norman Conquest in England and how after the Norman Conquest, the royalty took over the forests, and the forests used to be really agroforests there. They took over the forests and they made them into hunting reserves, and a lot of people had to move out. I'm afraid, that's where the scientific forestry that got imported into the United States came from. It didn't come from people who knew how to manage the dehesa or people who did swidden in the Black Forest, the local people. It came from the people that grew out of this movement to set aside the forests and keep people out. So now I'm going to talk about this group of Indians, because I think you wouldn't think there'd be that many parallels, but there are. I did a forest history for this group once for the government, and so I got to know them pretty well. And they're the Yurok Indians. They're here in Northern California. This is California, the Pacific Ocean. San Francisco's like here. Yeah. And they have redwoods. This is the redwood belt. They like this coastal area, and then evergreens, and then Douglas fir, and then as you keep going inland, it's more oaks and grass. And the Yurok, these are their towns. They're along a river here, lived along the river, and you can see that there's a lot more towns as you get kind of in this intermediate belt. Why do you think there's so many of their villages were here? Well, it's because if you're going to live in the forest and make it your home, you need to be able to use these different vegetation types. And the redwoods, there's hardly any villages in there because redwood forests are beautiful, but they're very low in biodiversity, very low, unusually low. There's one. Okay, so the resources that people really needed were in these little openings like this. Wherever there were places that had little grasslands, that's where a lot of the things that people needed to live were in these, where there weren't trees. In fact, well, I'll tell you later. So here along a river, you've got these hardwoods, you've got shrubs, you've got grasses. These not only produce fruits and nuts, but it's also where you find the deer and the elk that you need to hunt to get meat. Obviously, you lived a lot off of fish, but all of these things were very important. Willows like this were very important use for making equipment and baskets, and all these openings were just precious to them because they had so much forest. These are Thule elk. I think they're a lot like your red deer, similar. In the early 1900s, an exploratory party of American explorers went here and they said, there's all these small open areas, small prairies, grasslands. They have grass, ferns, plants. They would have all turned into forest because these trees grow so vigorously. But the Indians burn them every year. They set fire to them. They told me that after they hunted, they liked to set fire to the forest. That was just a tradition. And they kept these grasslands open so that they could keep producing these products. But now, even as early as 1900, the Indian population was already decimated, destroyed, lots less Indians than in the past. They said even now in 1900, there's more trees, more wooded area than when white people came, when Europeans came to California at first. Those people were, by the way, Spanish. But so there's a lot more trees now, even that early. The Indians used fire, Native Americans. They would burn so often, because you guys know about fire, that when you burn often, it doesn't make a huge fire. It makes a low fire because there's not enough wood to burn, right? And the trees, you have to have a good setup of wood and smaller trees to make the big trees catch. So if you burn at the right time of year and you burn often, you tend to see the kind of forest that our famous environmentalists found, like John Muir. When they came to California, they talked about the forests, the Sierra forests, as the range of light, the mountains of light, because the trees are far apart and open. You can see through them a long, long ways. So they could alter species composition, get more of the plants that they needed more of, and they could change wildlife at human habitat, all using fire. Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menziesii, grows really well there. And it grows from seeds. So it's pretty easy. If you burn frequently, you can really reduce the number of Douglas firs, right? This fir is now known as the white man's fir or the devil fir by these Indians. But anyway, it's very easy to control it with fire. Redwoods, not so much. Redwoods are very hard to burn. And so the redwoods, they didn't. They burned underneath them, but they didn't use them very much. The Douglas fir has always encroached on our grasslands, our prairies, and crowded out all of the other plants. We have continuously burned it, and we've done everything we could to keep it from taking over the open areas. This is from this Indian woman. And all these things that she's wearing that aren't from the ocean are from small plants, not trees, right? This is after a fire in a Douglas fir forest. This is called bear grass. It's a very important grass for weaving, for example. And you know, baskets are not for fun, right? If you don't have plastic and you don't have glass or pottery, baskets are really important. This grass is long and you can weave it and it's very strong. So they made these beautiful baskets using these grasses. They're important for carrying stuff, but also for their religions. You wear these baskets when you have an important ceremony to conduct. This is a recent photo. When you're getting your graduation diploma from President Obama, you should wear it. So those are very important to them. In the middle, after a burn, you know, you get these shrubs eventually, and they are very important. These are hazelnuts grow there, fruits. Game is attracted to these kind of sites. You can hunt there. They like that. After a while, if you burn, you get more oaks in this kind of forest. You get more oaks. This oak, it's not a true oak. It's a lithocarpus. But this acorn is evidently delicious. So getting this, because they eat these little beyotas, and it does very well with fire. It resprouts rapidly and grows, and the drier and more fire you have, the more of these oaks you can get in this forest. These are a couple of Yurok Indians, and they will tell you that their grandmother taught them how to burn, and they still want to burn as much as they can. Problem is, it's against the law, right? So they can only do it. This is from a paper by Cocking et al., 2014. They just talk, I'm sure you guys know this too, about the relationship between disturbance and fire. With a lot of fire, you maintain an oak woodland. If you exclude fire, then the pines grow up, and then eventually you wind up with conifers like this. This is California today, by the way. So here, just to illustrate, this is a classic succession model, right? Of linear succession. So you start with grasses, shrubs, oak woodlands, firs, and the native people, the people who call this forest home, this is what they managed for. They needed more of these things. So they used fire to create more of this kind of environment to prevent this, because they couldn't eat these trees. They're nice. And they used them for some things. They made buildings and canoes. But in their environment, they had way too many trees. Fire. And fire again. Okay. So here's a picture of the reservation in 1912. And a forest surveyor, guy who came out to measure the forest and look at it for the government, said, this whole, you know what a reservation is, right? A place set aside for Indians. He said, this whole place is burnt. They're setting fires all the time. It's terrible. We have to stop it. The entire reservation. And shortly after this, the Forest Service took over this reservation to manage the forest, and fire was made illegal. It was bad. Fire was considered bad. So my second conclusion is, in the forest home, people need diversity, and this may mean managing for fewer trees. Just giving you a couple of examples. So what happened to the United States? Let's get to American forestry, right? 1890s, a guy named Bernhard Fernot. Have you heard of him? He was a guy from Prussia. He founded our first American forestry school at Cornell. And these are some things that he said in published things. He said, the whole fire question in the United States is one of bad habits and loose morals. In other words, setting fires is a sign that you're ethically bad, that you're loose morals. You're not a good person. It's a criminal act. Bad habits and loose morals. He brought scientific forestry from Northern Europe to the Western United States. So this is a man who really wanted to help the forest, but his ideas about what the forest needed were really different from the people who had lived there for 14,000 years. Okay, so the forestry that came to America was not this kind, right? Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the Forest Service, very famous man. Everybody has to learn about this in forestry school in the United States. There is no doubt that forest fires encourage a spirit of lawlessness and a disregard for property rights. You know, property rights are such a big deal to Americans. And here he's saying fire is a symptom that you don't care about property rights. It's anti-American, basically. It's lawless, it's criminal, and it's anti-American. John Muir, very famous conservationist, father of the national park system in the United States. For one thing, he never talked to an Indian in his life and despised the Indian people. But he also said, fire, the axe, and wholesale vandalism have long threatened the forests of the country with utter destruction. Nature sends down fire from heaven every year in lightning and makes the care of the forests and people all the more necessary. So he was complaining that lightning was kind of an abomination. And in fact, the NSF in the 1950s spent several $1 million trying to figure out how to stop lightning so that it wouldn't cause forest fires. That was an actual NSF project. It didn't work out. So what came out of this, of course, is the Forest Service protect and scientifically manage forests. And I think there's a reason why they look like an army, why the original uniform was military, because they were going to protect the forests from all the people that were using them for grazing, for living in, for burning, for hunting. Their goal was to protect the forests from people, basically, at the start. And their belief, this early US fire suppression, was fires are set by criminals. Ergo, if you set a fire, you're a criminal. They're going to stop Indians, farmers, ranchers, hunters from burning the woods and eliminate human use, in particular, from the national parks. It's patriotic to fight fire in these early signs. When they first started, the Forest Service launched the first ever really big public education campaign in the United States, and it was about fire and why we needed to stop fire. And they even brought out, I don't know, Uncle Sam, if you know who that is, the symbol of our country, one of them. But they really, this guy is the big guy, Smokey the Bear. Very powerful image. More people in the Congo recognize Smokey the Bear than the President of the United States. And this weakens America. This is terrible. Here's this little cub. I have to say that over the years, Smokey has become more buff, gotten stronger. He works out now. I don't know what that means. Yeah, okay. So here we have the traditional management for cultural materials, food, wildlife habitat, and diversity. But it got replaced by maximizing timber and trees, making that cycle through. I have a friend who calls this the conveyor belt, sort of industrial model of growing trees. We need more and more timber. And interestingly, in Germany and a lot of Europe, trees were really important military resources and kind of in short supply. And you needed, one of the things that drove the English to colonize America was to get the really big trees for the masts of ships. But in the United States, one of Gifford Pinchot's big frustrations was that we had so many trees, very few people, and really a lot of trees. And so it was hard to convince people that it was necessary to pursue this whole hog, and we never have really. But nonetheless, despite the fact that we were in a different climate and had different numbers of trees, this is the model that we tried to apply in the Forest Service. harvest and replant. Okay, so here's what this place looks like today. It's all trees. I couldn't take this picture. I went to what I thought was the same spot, and I would just be facing a tree. There was this huge trees. So it's really full of trees. Some friends of mine, Louise Fortman and Sally Fairfax, wrote a paper called The 4 Principles of Professional Forestry in the Third World. And these are the 4 principles, and I think we've talked about them. 1, forestry is growing trees. That's what it is. Complicated social and ecological problems can be fixed by growing trees. If people are poor, you fix it by growing more trees, right? That's development, grow more trees. The only real knowledge you need to do all this is the science of forestry, right? That's the only real knowledge that we believe in, that we can use. And you have to have central planning. You need to really plan these things on a large scale using science, okay? I want to point out that they were critical of this. They were not saying this is good. They were saying this is what has led us into conflict with the people that we're trying to help when we do a forestry project. And with the people of the United States, they're not happy either with forestry. Okay, so under early 20th century management, managers focused on trees. That's my third conclusion. And now I'm on the fourth part. What has happened as a result of this in California? We have terrible, absurdly terrible problems. Absurdly. Millions and billions of dollars. Billions. It's costing us billions every year. Fire, insects, and disease. We have a class at Berkeley called Fire, Insects, and Disease. They barely have to walk off campus. This high-frequency native burning that used to keep the forests open. This is a nice old painting in the Sierra, and you can see that even in the 1800s, you could see the places where fires had gone through. These are giant sequoias. Sequoia sempervirens? No, Sequoia, never mind. Giganteum. Anyway, there's some native people. That was the traditional forest. This is a picture of the Sierra around the turn of the century, turn of the 20th, 19th, end of the 19th century. Very open. Today, we've been really heavily suppressing fire since 1906. That's what it's like today. And we're talking about a Mediterranean climate, right? It's not like Prussia, Northern Europe. It's dry, and it's dry every summer. And so you have here, what you have is a wood pile just waiting to catch on fire. I talked to a Chinese friend. I said, you know, we have this terrible fire problem. And she says, what happens if there's a fire? Don't they just fire the forest supervisor and put him in jail? I said, no, it's impossible to stop fire. Anyway, so we have our meadows are being encroached upon. They're, you know, these trees are invading our grasslands. Now we have what we call road meadows. That's where the openings are in the forest. It's created some interesting conflicts, but what it means is that you've got your deer and your elk getting hit by cars a lot and so on. The increased density is incredible. In the national forests, we have 4 to 5 times the number of trees per hectare that we had in 1804. That's really a lot more trees than in 1804 when Lewis and Clark explored the continent. And in 2012, 9.3 million acres of national forests looked like this in the western United States. We managed to harvest for use by humans 200,000 acres. Sorry, that's in acres, forgot. Just divide by 2.5. Anyway, so this is what California looks like today a lot of the time. Here's Yosemite National Park. Has anybody been there? Have you guys ever been to Yosemite National Park? You have. You have, I know. Yes, it's beautiful. This is what a guy named Albert Bierstadt, the same guy who painted the beautiful giant sequoias, this is what it looked like for him in 1865. There's kind of a wetland down here, and you can see all these great things. 1907, there was a community of Indians living there who used to burn all the time. They set them out today. They're having to remove trees so that people can still see things in the valley. Okay, so that's a big change. This is the Berkeley Hills, 1900. These are oaks, by the way. Our oak woodlands tend to be distributed more like that. They're not nice and even. Here they are today. Okay. So we've done a really good job of growing trees. If only we could stop them from burning up all the time. We have, this is a lake near Los Angeles, tremendous die-offs from bark beetles among the conifer species. And of course, this just makes the fire problem worse because now we have all these dead trees. In 2015, a guy flew his plane with infrared, I think, machines to take pictures of the trees on the western side of our main mountain range. And these are basically standing dead. And it's like that throughout. Because we've had a big drought, and when the trees are so close together, they can't get enough water, which is something to think about with climate change. You need to plant trees further apart because they're going to need more space to get water. First non-Indian down the Grand Canyon. This is John Wesley Powell. He actually sat strapped to a chair. He only had one arm. But he was a very famous explorer and ethnographer. I like him better than John Muir. Here he is pictured. He's hiding the arm that he's missing behind this Indian guy and talking. He actually learned several Indian languages and retired as the head of the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnography. John Wesley Powell observed this about the forests. He was in Arizona at the time, but he said, under civilization, the great forests of the arid lands are being swept from the mountains and plateaus. They're being destroyed. Before the white man came, the natives burned over the forest land every year as one of the great hunting economies. By this process, there was actually very little destruction of the big trees. If you burn every year, you don't kill the big trees, just the small ones, the new ones. Now that they're protected by civilized people, they're disappearing. The forests are disappearing. The needles, cones, and brush, together with the leaves of the grass and shrubs below, accumulate until the ground is covered with a thick mantle of burnable material. Then a spark is dropped and the flames go crazy. Okay? So I think he's like our first forest ecologist, right? He understood this relationship between people and the forest and fire, which nobody else seemingly did. So we're having a lot more fires. They're bigger now than ever. This is the number of forest fires larger than 100,000 each year. There's 2007, this is Southern California. That's nice, right around LA. 2008, here's San Francisco. All that stuff burned. 2013, this is right outside of Yosemite. Huge fire, huge fire. Actually, Yosemite itself, because of a professor at Berkeley, has a burning program. They're the most advanced burning program in the United States. So Yosemite hasn't burned. They burn on purpose quite a lot at Yosemite. Okay. Yeah, houses go with it. So it costs billions of dollars because we build all our houses in the forest too. That's the American River fire, I think. Not so great. So, conclusion 4, our cultural worldview changes landscapes. The way we look at the landscape, what we think a forest is for, the way we think about the parts of a landscape, it actually has a result on the ground. It's not just in our heads. We wind up changing the landscape. And we in the United States, we like trees. So what I want to leave you with, though, the conclusion I have here, is to think about the future. I mean, we have a lot of forests that are burning down, and they're leaving us with this sort of blank slate, right? No trees left. What are we going to do differently? What are we going to do differently to keep this from happening? Especially if we think in this part of California it's going to get warmer and drier. So what are we going to do in the future, right? The head of the Arbor Day. Have you guys heard of Arbor Day? It's a big tree planting day all over the world. The head of the Arbor Day Foundation I sat next to him at dinner once recently, a year ago, I think, at Berkeley. And he's the head of the Arbor Day Foundation in the United States. And he said, he used to be a senator, but I forget his name. But he said, the Forest Service needs money to replant 9.3 million acres. We are going to raise money, the Arbor Day Foundation, and we're going to plant all those trees back. And I said, well, okay. I said, but who's going to manage them? Who's going to take care of them? Who's going to make sure they just don't grow up and burn down again? And I guess that's you, right? You guys. But he just looked at me. He couldn't think of a thing to say. And then finally he said, well, I guess things are complicated. And I said, yeah, they're complicated. It's not so easy as just planting trees. Okay, so I'm wondering, are we going to, in the United States, a lot of people want to reintroduce burning. It's very hard because we'd have to start with a clean slate, because once the forests get to a certain point, if you set a fire, it's going to cause a disaster no matter what. So, but can we use this in California? A lot of people want to. Can we plant trees further apart, plant fewer trees? Will people let us do that? In Spain, could we plant more oaks and chestnuts and native species and less conifers? Would that be a way to handle this? Can we do more thinning? We have a public problem, or we have a lot of members of the public in the United States that think every tree is precious and we should never cut down a tree, even if we planted it, right? At Berkeley, we have people who sit in trees when we try to build a parking lot, even though the trees were planted along by the campus. You know, they love trees. So in the United States, it's very hard for the Forest Service to do a lot of thinning. But maybe if you start before the trees grow too much, it'll be more socially acceptable. Maybe this is a clean slate where we have an opportunity to manage differently and recreate a forest that's safer. And I believe we should do more grazing in the forests in the United States. For some reason, my colleagues in forestry don't take grazing seriously. I don't know why. They have it in their minds that a cow might eat a tree and that would be the end of the world, you know? And I think that the fact that a cow might once in a while eat a tree kind of goes in hand with this, right? So what? There's so many trees. My dissertation, I studied a shelter belt where there were just so many trees. The cows ate a few, but there were plenty left. So, you know, it's just, livestock grazing is inexpensive. In fact, in the United States, a grazer will pay you to graze. You don't have to pay for it. And it can be, it's safer. And when you have houses around, it's very hard to do burning. So grazing is simple, and there are all kinds of animals. Goats like brush, cows eat brush if it's really small. Livestock grazing is best right after a fire before the trees get big. So there's all kinds of things that could be done. So I'm ending this talk by just saying we need to look a little at the past to help figure out how to create the future forest that's going to last, not burn down, survive climate change, and maintain biodiversity. This is Mexico, the Mexican forests just south of LA that have never been protected from anything. It's also drier, so the trees are smaller, but you see they have that, they're not going to burn down very easily either. They just don't. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Great, I'd love to answer questions. Don't make me sad, ask a question. Yes?
Yes, excuse me. Thank you for your presentation, it was brilliant. I have a question about how do you think things worked before the natives came about, I don't know, 1,000 years ago?
I think of it, the forests were mainly managed by ice ages. Well, that is a really good question. I mean, it's complicated by the fact that the weather was different. You know, you have the little ice age, then you have the Pleistocene, the Native Americans and the Pleistocene sort of go together. But I think different climates, different things. Now in California, if the climate was similar to today, you would expect that there'd just be a lot of fire anyway, because it's very dry in the summer, lots of vegetation growth in the winter, it dries out completely, and then we have lightning, a lot of lightning up in the mountains. So you would expect to have a fair amount of fire, and that it might go for days and days. And in fact, it did. When the first explorers came to California, there was fires that just burned for long, long periods of time. So I would expect more fire, but not as much as there was under the Native Americans. And then in a lot of the arid West, some places were wetter, some places were drier. But I think it was probably similar. In Yellowstone National Park, they've hypothesized that some of the places there where it's moister in the summer and there's more rain, that the vegetation would build up, and then every 200 years you'd have a huge fire. Have you heard that too? I think it's a yellow pine forest or something. Yeah, but the problem with that is we can't have that. You know, okay, maybe in Yellowstone National Park, but yeah, that's a really good field to study, and you can go back and look at charcoal, you can look at fire scars, but it's hard to go back 14,000 years, I guess, but there's ways. I think it's a great field of study.
So it would be some kind of a matter of a larger scale heterogeneity more than a smaller scale heterogeneity. So it would be like I would say a mosaic of several patches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Many states of successional stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, you know, these Yurok, we're trying to manage for lots of patches too. So yeah, I think that's right. There'd be a lot of heterogeneity. And you know, because fire doesn't burn everywhere, and it burns at different degrees, different temperatures. Yeah, I really think that's true. Yeah.
Well, I might have another question.
Good.
What do you think is the role of the dead wood in the forest, in the standing trees, dead trees, and the fallen dead trees?
Well, that's a really good question. And, you know, I think that it's not my field of expertise, but of course, the standing dead trees are very important for wildlife. We have a number of species in owls. In fact, our timber harvest rules stipulate that you will leave snags or dead trees behind because they're so important for wildlife. But when you have a situation where you have a catastrophic fire, they're all destroyed. You know, so, but some standing dead trees are good for wildlife. Clearly, the kind of wildlife that benefits from standing dead trees is probably having a field day right now. But anyway, yeah, all of those stages are important. But it's like everything else. How much do you need? How much are we going to have? And that's why I like this idea of balancing. If you have too much wood, then you put all of that wood at risk. And when you have a fire, then all these greenhouse gases are released, and you have all kinds of big fire. It's really, but that's the irony of using wood or trees to some extent for carbon sequestration, is the more and denser the trees, the more it's at risk, right? And so you have to sort of balance between those two. In the forest, of course, the deteriorating wood is an important source of nutrients, and all kinds of microorganisms and wildlife live in that. Yeah, that's true. But it's a case of, you know, how much? Yeah, how much? Yeah. Wildlife is an interesting thing to manage, because if you change the habitat one way, you benefit some species. You change it the other way, you benefit others, you know? Yeah. And in the United States, we don't know if we're managing for things that were just there because of Indians, or, I mean, what's natural, you know, when you think about all that. I'm sorry, you had a question.
I was interested in asking what's the situation with old growth forest, because there's much evidence in documentaries, in photos, that especially the trees of big dimensions were cut down when the people came, and trees that were growing for thousands of years. So it takes a long time to reconstruct or so there might be a lot of trees in California, but the old ecosystems, it's not easy to recover.
It's not easy even to maintain them. So in our national forests, in our national parks, we protect. Yosemite has a lot of old growth sequoia, redwood forests, beautiful forests. But that's one of the reasons why they started to try to recover Indian burning. It's like you can't recover one without the other. Because if you go there, you'll see they have explanations that these big trees, they're in the forest, they grow pretty far apart. Sequoia is very fire resistant. It has a very thick bark and it's got a lot of epicormic bedding. But in the absence of fire, little conifers come up, lots of them. Abies concolor is the big one that comes up in the shade of these big trees. And unfortunately, it takes water from the big trees and it creates a fire problem or a fuel ladder where the fire can get up higher into the trees. And so even maintaining these old growth forests, that's one reason why Yosemite has a burning program, is because they got to keep these little trees, these little conifers out of the redwood forest. So yeah, part of the recovery of the old growth is recovering the thousands of years of management by Native Americans that created those old growth forests. So we have quite a problem with our old growth forests now because of this influx of new trees that are making it harder on the old trees. Yeah. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
We have quite a bit of old growth in California. We should have more, but of course we chopped it down. And it seems like when you say recover the old growth forests, right now we have to start thinking about what that means to recover or restore, because our climate's going to be different in the next couple hundred years. So we can't think about just recovering and restoring. We have to think about creating a new old growth forest that can survive in a new climate, right? We can't really go back. Not only do we have this climate problem, we have a species problem too. We have so many new species in California. Maybe it's not so much in Spain. You know, we have, our whole grassland is now Spanish grass from the Mediterranean regions of Europe. We have lots of invasive species. So our forests are really different, and we're not going back. Unless some aliens come and fix everything. It's not happening.
If I understood well, the big fires are more or less unnatural because too much biomass, too much timber mass is accumulated because of lack of management.
Yeah, whether it's unnatural or not is a good question, but they're unprecedented. They haven't happened in the length since the United States was created. We have never seen such a situation.
So I agree that it's not only planting trees, but we can decrease the number of, or the severity of fires through juvenile killing, tending.
Yeah.
And this way reach again maybe the...
That's exactly right. That's what we need to do, but I'm afraid that people aren't thinking about that. But that's what we need to do is figure out.
In 1,000 years we can reach old growth again.
Well, except will the climate ever be the same in 1,000 years? I don't know. You know, will we have the same species? No, probably not. So, but I agree. It would be nice if we could, but we at least need to recreate. I think I would like to see a forest of big trees, further apart. Nice grasslands. I'd like to see a more diverse mixed forest that's what we call fire resistant or fire resilient. Yeah, I have my idea of an ideal world. But you know, tree planting is an interesting issue. I just spent half a year in China, and they do a lot of tree planting in China. And one of the things that drives tree planting that makes it so appealing, in the United States too, for people like the Arbor Day Foundation, is because everybody loves trees. You know, we're taught to love trees, and they're nice. But also because you can say what you did, you know. It's hard to say, hey, I managed 3,000 hectares for biodiversity. See? Everybody goes, how do we know? What do you mean? But if I say, hey, I planted 3,000 hectares of trees, then you can see that I really did something. It's easy to see. In China, if a forester or a government official reports to the government, I planted 5,000 hectares of trees, wow, that's good. It's a good reason, you know, so it becomes, sort of feeds itself, it drives itself. Doesn't matter if they're planted where they can't possibly survive. And, you know, it doesn't matter if they die in a few years or if they burn down. You planted them, you did something with the money, you know. So I think, yeah. Did you have a question? Oh, good. What a row of thinkers.
First, thanks for your talk. I just was wondering if you think that prescribed burning and grazing can be actually an effective solution at a huge scale as it's forest in California, because I think that I mean they're effective, but at a really local and small scale, and we are talking about huge wildfires.
Yeah.
California.
Yeah.
And also the social and economic cost is really high. So
Yeah.
I find it difficult as a really effective solution.
Well, there's kind of two solutions. One is to do something like thinning, which we in the United States, in California, I saw the estimate of the price that it would cost to really thin our forests. It's astronomical, the cost. There's prescribed burning, there's grazing, or there's just letting it burn down. One of those things is going to happen to a lot of places. There's not another choice. So it's going to burn down or get sick or die, or get sick, die, and burn down, or we're going to do something to stop that. So what they're talking about now is places that are important like Yosemite, places that are near houses and cities. That's where we have to start. You know, that's where we have to begin. Those smaller areas, because nobody has the money to do the whole thing. And also, once a forest has gotten really dense, it's very hard to go back. So that's why I think it's time, when we have a big fire, it's really important to think about what we do afterwards, because that's going to either maintain the problem or give us more choices. So since we're having such big fires and such big areas that are set back to zero, we have to those places are really important, and that's how eventually I think we're going to get at a bigger scale. But I agree with you. I have a friend, Scott Stevens. He just had an article in Science magazine about fire policy in the United States, and he loves prescribed burning, and he is such an expert, and he wants to do it. And it's just hard to think that you can just start doing that now at any large scale. But if you took the post-fire forests and the trees were further apart and you managed the vegetation, it could be easy to do prescribed burning at a large scale. You know what I mean? You could do things at a large scale if you were starting from a better place, where if you didn't drop a match, you didn't have a catastrophe. You know, so I think that it's really going to take a long time, unless we somehow we decide let's get out of Afghanistan and fix our forests. That would be good. Then we would have the money, right? But it's not that big of a priority. It's expensive. So instead, every year we spend billions of dollars. I mean, literally a couple of years ago, it was $2 billion just in California from fires, wildfires. I don't know. That's also, it's much easier. That's another thing about the way the political process works. I used to work for the biggest fire program in California. It's called CAL FIRE. It's the state firefighting unit. It's one of the two top in the world, California and Australia, right? Similar problems. And every year we would go to the politicians at the state and say, this year is going to be the worst fire year ever. We're going to have more disasters this year than ever, so you need to give us more money, right? We got to fight these fires. But it's much harder to go to a politician and say, we need to stop these. We need to prevent them. If you give us money, we'll prevent them. It's very hard to get money for preventative care. And that's something we're facing.
I think that's what it's similar to Spain.
Yeah, it's the way government works to some extent. You have to have a fight. I guess you could say, we're going to fight bushes. I don't know. But it's hard to say, we're going to fight too many trees. Nobody likes that. Oh gosh, it's after 1. Yes, Alejandro.
So I see climate change is going to be important coming into this picture, I guess.
As much as anybody knows, yes.
So it's going to be worse for this, but that's the thing you already said. But I think also climate change policy may be worse, because first you have maybe reforestation, then maybe saying if we set a fire, we are causing it, so we are emitting on purpose more CO2. So is this coming into the debate? Do you have reforestation plans in California with explained to the public as one of the climate change policies? What do you have?
Oh yes, of course. It's not, yes, we do. We have, it's not, you don't see it as much as you do in Spain because we still have so many trees, right? So, but yes, there have been efforts to set aside forests and say this is for carbon sequestration. We're going to replant, we're going to plant trees for carbon sequestration. And I heard somebody say, you know, we have these oak woodlands that are like your dehesa, same grass, some of the same flowers even, and then these oaks that are pretty far apart. And there's been a proposal that we should plant oaks on many more trees on this land. That it's wrong that it's grass and oaks. It should be a forest. And that carbon sequestration is a reason to do that. However, that's also where we get most of our water. So first we would have a big fire problem, and modelers are not we need people to model what the consequences are of this for fire, because when you have a fire you lose all the carbon that you've sequestered and it creates some nitrates and other gases, but that's one thing. You have a much more high likelihood of fire, but it also uses a lot of water. So we're short on water in California all the time. So it's a trade-off, sequester carbon, less water, you know. So nobody's carried that any further, fortunately, because it would, besides the fact that it would ruin a lot of good grazing land and make all of the grazing people unhappy, it doesn't make sense in that climate, yeah. Well, we have a state forest specifically for carbon sequestration. I don't know how they're going to manage that in the future. And whether it's going to burn down or not, I don't know. But I think we do more damage as a country by going other places and telling people to plant trees myself. And by people, well-meaning people giving money to organizations who say, we're going to plant trees in China, it's so great, you know. We're going to plant trees, so yeah. It's after 1, so I thank you guys for staying so long, and thank you for your questions, but I think I should let people go.
Again, thank
All right.
you for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful time here in Spain.
I am having a wonderful time here in Spain. I love Spain.
Thank you.
You're welcome.